Greetings everyone, it's time for more movies! Yay! Anyway, I know what you're all thinking, another one of these, just give us Sonic 2 already, yada yada yada, but actually I think I might, depending upon whether or not I upload this will either be before or after the Sonic the Hedgehog 2 review, so depending upon what happens, we'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, on the day that I filmed this, it is January 27th, 2017, and I have just seen Resident Evil, the final chapter, on opening day. And, say what you will about the live-action Resident Evil movies, but I think this is probably my second favourite one in the series. But I'll get into that in a little moment, but first, as is tradition on this channel, I guess, it is time to have a drink of Pepsi. So again, just like last time, I'll be talking about the pros, or positives, negatives, and nice little touches that I enjoyed, as well as my general opinion on the movie, since, well, it just came out. And I actually do have a lot to talk about with this movie, because I really do quite enjoy it a lot. Well, I suppose, first of all, I should probably go into what I think about the other Resident Evil movies first, as I did review the first one about 2 or 3 years ago. Fuck, it's been that long. And I guess for a general frame of reference, because I do plan to review Resident Evil Apocalypse around, I'd say it's either April or May of this year, so I'll save my thoughts on Apocalypse for later. But as for the first one, just to generally reiterate, that is probably my favourite movie in this series, and despite, you know, not following the video games plot, you know, with the whole Arclay Mansion, you know, Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and all that kind of crap, with, you know, stars and everything, I still enjoy Resident Evil 1 as a standalone movie. Again, as an adaptation, I think it falls flat on its ass. But, like, and again, I view this similarly to the first Assassin's Creed movie in the sense that it's telling its own stories, it's got its own characters, and just taking basic elements from the games. And the way in which the first Resident Evil movie tells its story, I quite enjoy. As for Apocalypse, you'll hear my opinions on that later this year. Resident Evil Extinction was where the movie started to go downhill for me, and I think it was mostly in terms of aesthetics, because it was just mostly set in a desert with the occasional cuts to like a lab and a post-apocalypse civilization compared to the generally civilized populace of Resident Evil Apocalypse, or at least for what little we saw of that world. And well, that and a weak villain as well, and again that does kind of cross over into the final chapter as well. But on the whole, Resident Evil Extinction was just eh. Afterlife I enjoyed a little bit more, even though it did just throw in characters like, you know, Chris and Claire just purely for what the hell. But on the whole, I still found Afterlife generally entertaining. I mean, especially with the fucking... Again, I can't quite remember the character's name, but he has the line, like, towards the end of the movie going, "Stop, hell, bitches!" And again, I still enjoyed Afterlife, and that for the completely weird scene which it rips off Resident Evil 5 where it has Wesker throw his sunglasses at Chris. But yeah, Afterlife I generally enjoyed. Retribution, I have very little memory of, and personally that movie wasn't really that good anyway, so Retribution was kind of a letdown, and I guess that might play into my opinion and general appraisal of the final chapter. But again, finally getting to the final chapter itself, I like this movie. And again, I've been saying that for a lot of movies, but again, in a general sense, especially compared to movies like, you know, Extinction and Retribution, I think the final chapter was a great way to win the series, and again, I'm going to get into it with the positives and negatives now, so let's go. Now, my first point of praise, and again, one that is actually fairly critiqued for a lot of the Resident Evil movies in general, is really the way that this movie handled the Alice character story arc, because again, in Resident Evil 1, it's set up as like she's an amnesiac with absolutely no memory of what's going on, with brief flashes back to a false marriage, and just a general conspiracy plot where she was plotting to go against Umbrella. And again, interesting arc, something that I feel was a great way to start the character, despite people's, you know, disdain for not having Jill or Chris or any of the people from the original games into the movie. Again, it's a good starting point. Resident Evil Apocalypse, however, introduced the whole idea of the T-Virus giving her powers, and again, that's something that I will get into in the Resident Evil Apocalypse review. But again, her character in that movie was handled eh. As for Extinction, Afterlife, and Retribution, the character just seemed fairly static, because Extinction introduced the idea of clones, which in Afterlife was completely wasted. I don't think it was even brought up in Retribution to my memory, and if it was, then I don't think it was really handled very well. And in this movie, it actually does tie in with a lot of her backstory in the sense that, you know, she is a clone. Yes, the one from all the way back in Resident Evil 1 was... I say Resident Evil 1, but I mean the first movie. The version of her in that movie was in fact a clone, and the original was involving slightly retconish things from Apocalypse, since it establishes a lot about the T-Virus, but again, I'll get into that a little bit later with the negatives. But in terms of setting up an established story arc, or at least in terms of the first movie, Apocalypse, excuse me, and her conclusion in the final chapter, I think her conclusion with this movie was handled pretty decently, in a similar manner to Metal Gear Solid, actually, in the sense that, you know, even though this person is a clone, they have their own life and they can lead their own existence, which, again, is not quite touched upon as I would have liked it to be, but nonetheless, I still think it is something that was handled pretty decently considering the previous two movies. Now, my second point of praise, and one that I actually do hold in regards, like, over the other movies in the series, particularly Extinction and Retribution, I really love the industrial setting of this movie. Like, again, I think this movie looks fantastic from a design aspect, and especially a lot of the cinematography as well. Like, and again, it's really hard for, I guess, anybody to really envision this without having seen the movie, so I'm going to assume you have. Just the way a lot of the panning shots are done, especially when you get a good look at the Hive, which they do return to in this movie since it was the setting of the first one. A lot of the panning shots and a lot of the cinematography really does show that this place has aged and decayed to such an extent, and again, maybe it's just me being a sucker for industrial environments, but I really love how this movie just showcases, you know, what would be the word to use? I suppose the dilapidated decay of the building, and again, while it does showcase that pretty well, it also has a lot of the stuff that, you know, you would have seen in the first movie, and again, it's a lot of that visual design that's brought back into this movie, and I love it so much for that. Like, again, it feels so cold and isolated, which, again, really does help to feel the idea that, yes, this is a virus testing facility, and yes, this is where shit was going down. And again, while it isn't quite as cold and sterile as it was, you know, in some of the other movies, especially Afterlife in the giant ship, where it was just, you know, all apple white, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Again, I like this movie because, again, it was just cold grey steel, and it's the kind of design aesthetic that, on a personal level, I do very much enjoy. And my second point of praise is actually the fight choreography, which, again, I think I've probably been spoiled by watching Triple X The Return of Xander Cage, and again, I can notice a lot of the cuts which, you know, go from real actress or actor to stunt double, and again, that's noticeable in a lot of Western movies, you know, when you see people who clearly haven't trained in martial arts for years on end. But again, even despite the quick cuts, I do quite enjoy a lot of the choreography, which in this movie, and especially in a general sense compared to previous films, I think the choreography is probably some of the best it's ever been. And again, that really does go out of its way to really keep your attention during the action scenes. I think my third or fourth point of praise is honestly the pacing of the movie in general. Because unlike Resident Evil Extinction or Retribution, and even Afterlife to some extent, you know, the pacing of this movie was, I think, tremendously handled, especially considering that a lot of the slow parts of, you know, Extinction, Afterlife, and Retribution tended to be pretty slow and plotting. This movie, and especially the way it places its action sequences, it does well to keep your attention, even though I think that 2 or 3 of those action scenes were somewhat filler and not really getting anywhere, because there was this one scene towards the midway point of the movie where, you know, Alice and a group of the survivors were trying to defend their compound, which, again, makes sense to some degree, but considering that they were heading off to the Hive anyway, it seems kind of pointless. But again, nonetheless, it is probably one of the most memorable action scenes of the movie, and one that I do still enjoy, just purely on the virtue of it being an action scene, rather than, you know, just in a pivotal point of the plot. I suppose moving on to the negatives is, again, I don't have many for this movie, but the one that I do have is the retcons, which, again, admittedly weren't quite as bad, or at least to me anyway, at least until it got to Resident Evil Afterlife, where they began to play fast and loose with continuity. I mean, again, it started with, in Resident Evil Extinction it was established that the world began to dry up and die, and again, that was reflected in the fact that the setting was mostly a desert plain, but then with Resident Evil Afterlife, the world apparently had some, you know, life to it again. You know, there was trees, there was beaches, there was water, and in a general sense it was kind of confusing. And again, this movie does have it to some degree as well with the whole T-virus and its origins, because again, in Resident Evil Apocalypse, it was established that it was done for the Ashford family, and again, I can't quite remember the names because I haven't seen the movies in some time, but again, it was established that for the Ashford kid who was in Apocalypse and that they were guarding to get access out of the Raccoon City. Again, it was established that the virus is there to help her because she was paralyzed. And again, in this movie, it was established that it was there as like an anti-aging thing, antibody, so to speak. Again, I'm not phrasing myself very well, but this is just the best I could describe it in my current frazzled brain state. And again, it was established to be an anti-aging antibody, which was there to prevent, well, the real Alice from dying, which, again, is a decent plot point if it didn't cross over into, okay, then why the hell was, you know, the whole Ashford subplot of Resident Evil Apocalypse such a big deal? And again, I'm not going to hold it against, you know, this movie, well, at least Apocalypse, because, you know, that was a movie made back in 2004 compared to one made in 2017, and they probably didn't have all the details matched out yet, but nonetheless, the fast and loose with continuity does bother me. I mean, especially for your own self-contained story, but nonetheless, bothers me to some degree, at least from somebody who does enjoy the Resident Evil live-action movies. I suppose my second point of negativity would probably be with the weak villain of this movie, and this is also shared with Resident Evil Extinction in that Dr. Isaacs, I think his name is, made for a pretty weak villain. And again, I thought he made for a pretty weak villain in Extinction as well, since he just turned to a giant blob creature, well, not a blob creature, but just like this BOW weapon, and I just didn't find him that threatening, you know? Like, I mean, even in this movie, where he's played off as, like, more of a human antagonist, and, you know, he comes across against his own clone with the whole religious aspects, I don't know, he just didn't seem to have the same impact that Wesker had, you know? I mean, even in the Resident Evil movies, which I think do kind of butcher the whole Wesker character in general, although not to any bigger extent than they would have the games themselves, especially with Resident Evil 5 and Code Veronica. But nonetheless, like, I mean, I think they probably could have gone with a better villain, at least for the final chapter anyway. I guess my third and final negative critique would probably also be for the soundtrack, because, again, in general, I would still say that the first Resident Evil movie had a phenomenal fucking soundtrack, with a collaboration between Marco Beltrami and Marilyn Manson doing the soundtrack, which, again, it sounded so ambient and so cool, that it really did do well to emphasize the horror of that movie. And again, while I can find this as an understandable compromise since the movies moved more towards action than they did horror, it's still something that, you know, in a general sense, I think the score did do well to emphasize the horror, which later movies would eventually abandon in favor of, you know, like a more boom and, you know, generic action soundtrack, but, you know, at least up until Extinction anyway, they still had some heavy metal tracks playing every now and again, which, from Resident Evil 1, Apocalypse, and Extinction, I did enjoy. They got rid of slightly for Afterlife, save for that one Perfect Circle track, but it was completely gone by Retribution, and again, sadly, it isn't present here, so I am sad that there are no more licensed tracks from metal bands, but again, it's probably just a superficial complaint only met with by me. So nonetheless, soundtrack was okay. But on that note, however, and to be slightly more positive, there was a bit more of an industrial influence, and one that I feel it does, to some degree, set a few certain tracks apart, because again, there are some tracks in here which do play up the ambience, and especially going with the cinematography and specific scenes, it did do well to emphasize, you know, the horror aspects of this movie, which I'd say handled it to an even better degree than Resident Evil Apocalypse did. Again, it doesn't quite get on par with the first movie in terms of trying to be atmospheric and horror, but it does get pretty damn close, which, again, for this movie, I can appreciate. I suppose for some nice little touches, or just to finish up on those nice little touches, I should say, is generally how, and again it goes into my previous point, is how it tried to bring back the horror slightly. And again, it's only slightly, but it is trying. And again, whether or not this is there to coincide with Resident Evil 7 returning to its horror roots, I don't know. But I am very appreciative, because there are a lot of scenes where, despite using a lot of, you know, the generic jump scares, which again, being the horror aficionado I am, I called out like clear as day. You know, I did enjoy a lot of the scenes where it was just, you know, empty room, you know, the deceased, you know, mangled corpses just hanging around, not even moving, and just the general ambience of the scene speaking for itself. You know, and those scenes, I feel, worked very effectively, and if this movie had, or at least limited its jump scares a little, I think this movie probably would have emphasized, you know, the entire horror of it a little bit better, and subsequently the jump scares themselves probably would have been a little bit more funny, because you wouldn't have, well, not to say that you wouldn't have seen them coming, because again, most horror movie fans can easily call this out, but at the very least, it probably would have caught a few people off guard, because I definitely remember while watching the movie, I was thinking like, okay, there's going to be a jump scare. I waited for a few more seconds, I was like, oh, they're actually playing out the ambience. I was quite surprised. And again, if there's anything I can put towards the movie's favour, I'd say that it does play out the ambience a little bit, not quite to the extent of the first movie, but it does try, and I can appreciate that. And so, to sum up my final thoughts on the movie, again, Resident Evil The Final Chapter is one that I'd say, again, in terms of ranking the Resident Evil movies, or at least the live-action ones, it's the first movie, The Final Chapter, and Apocalypse as my 3 favourites. And again, this movie does have a lot for me to like. I mean, again, even despite its flaws, which, you know, do somewhat hold it back a little bit, in a general sense, I really love what this movie brings to the table. It brings back some of the horror a little bit, it gives a nice conclusion to the Alice character, despite what a lot of fans might think of her, and in a general sense, you know, in terms of being a conclusion to the franchise, the movie franchise itself, I think The Final Chapter does a decent job, so if you are a fan of the Resident Evil movies, or at least the live-action ones, then I'd say check out The Final Chapter. It's definitely a lot better than Retribution or Extinction. I suppose before I close off, if I can touch upon something like, I mean, again, as somebody who does enjoy some of the live-action Resident Evil movies, again, if, you know, Capcom does decide to make a more faithful adaptation of the Resident Evil games, you know, setting in the Arkley Mansion, you know, stars, and the general plot of Resident Evil 1, I'd be fine with that, you know, if it does happen in a couple of years, but again, for what we have now with the whole Alice story arc, I did enjoy the ride while I had it, so I guess to cap things off, I'm Skully, keep it new metal, and at the time of recording, I should either have Sonic 2 done, or you can look forward to Sonic CD. Catch you on the flip side. And, before we close off again, drink Pepsi.